And I'm so glad you're here. This is beautiful. So, my name is Diana Batarsi. I'm on staff here at Christ Community. And what is so amazing is that we're in a day where we can devote some time to some of the subjects that we'll be considering tonight and throughout the year. But we'll hear a little bit more about that. My job is to say welcome to you. And I want to tell you about coffee and goodies. If you're not from Christ Community, I love seeing some folks from the community here. You need to go to the restroom. There's some right outside these doors, okay, this way and behind. So make yourselves at home. We do have a merch table over here. This is from our speaker. She'll tell more about it. It's free, except for a stack of books that are hopefully clearly marked. Those are for sale. She'll tell you a little bit more about that. But we are really glad that you're here, and I'm going to introduce our senior pastor, David Cassidy, who's going to give you a little bit of background on why we're doing what we're doing tonight. So welcome. David?
I was going to introduce myself, but Diana already did that, so I'm grateful for that. Why these forums? Well, there are 3 planned this year, and hopefully these will be the first of many. And these are opportunities for in-depth conversations about the places where the gospel intersects with the pain and the discomfort of the fallen world in which we live. These are opportunities for us to think deeply about and talk together about how we apply the implications of the good news of Jesus to our relationships, our friendships, what it means to love God and love our neighbors. And so we look forward to these times together. This particular issue of race is, of course, something which is deeply painful and at times controversial. Many people have suffered in this country because of racial prejudice. And of course, as Christians, we believe that all people are the image bearers of God. They're made in God's image. And so what we want to do is see how we, who call ourselves Christians, live out the truth of that common grace with our neighbors, whether Christian or not. Those of us who call ourselves, in particular, Reformed Presbyterian Christians, have a unique opportunity and responsibility to step into some of the painful places of that discussion. Because in our own history, whether we're talking about the Dutch Reformed and apartheid in South Africa, or the role of Presbyterian and Reformed theologians in the South, like Dabney and Thornwell, or even Jonathan Edwards, who owned slaves and promoted and defended slavery, Dabney and Thornwell in particular, or Southern Presbyterian leaders who remained silent in the face of racial injustice, or who actually defended Jim Crow. Those kinds of issues in our own past are the kinds of things that we have to face up to and own and make sure that we have a story which is written that is more reflective of the wide embrace of God's grace. And so it is especially incumbent on us to listen deeply and carefully and thoughtfully to the experience of others and to live the love of Christ with all those who call on the name of the Lord, and then especially with those who don't. And to therefore reflect the love of neighbor that Jesus commands of us. This is important, not only in how we treat each other, but how we treat those who are around us, and in that way, demonstrate to the world not only the truth of Jesus' claims on our lives, but the claims of the Creator on all people. And so I want to invite you to join me in a word of prayer, and then I'm going to hand off to Carl. So let's pray together. Our gracious God and Father, how we thank you for your great goodness to us, bestowed on us in the gift of your Son, Jesus. And we thank you for that. And we thank you for all those who are gathered here tonight, friends and members together. And we pray that you will give us eyes to see and ears to hear and hearts to understand. Give us the Holy Spirit to direct our steps. And for this, we give you thanks through Christ our Lord. Amen. To introduce our speaker, Carl, thank you so much, brother.
Awesome. Welcome, guys. Today, I have the great privilege of introducing our very first C3 Forum speaker, Dr. Elissa Yukiko Weichbrodt. Elissa is Associate Professor of Art at Covenant College. She received her undergrad in interdisciplinary studies from Covenant in 2004, and then went on to receive her BA and PhD in art history and archaeology from Washington University in St. Louis. Elissa is passionate on topics such as social justice and visual representation. Some of her most recent writings can be found in a book called My Heritage, right over there. Elissa is loved by her students and colleagues, and her unique gift of helping college students wrestle with issues of race, gender, and theology have shaped my mind and my life significantly. Her classes are some of the most popular at Covenant, having students consistently on the wait list. I had the privilege of learning under her teaching during my time at Covenant, and Elissa has helped me develop my love for art and shape my thinking and perspective on many important issues. Her home is a safe space for me and for a lot of her students, and she has always just been a loving mother in my hardest times in life. Elissa is married to Noel Weichbrodt and has two sons, Zeke, age 10, and Miles, age 8. Please join me in welcoming up Dr. Elissa Yukiko Weichbrodt.
Thank you. Thanks, Carl. Thank you all for being here. I just want to say a thank you to Diana and to Ken and to Carl for the invitation to come and to be able to talk with you tonight about something that I'm really passionate about. I also do want to thank my institution, Covenant College, down in Lookout Mountain, Georgia, outside of Chattanooga. They have been very supportive of my work, of my research, and there's a table over there with t-shirts and other stuff if you're interested in learning more about the college. So, what are we talking about? Well, my husband and I have a little game that we play on occasion. He is a big music aficionado, and sometimes he will text me the album cover of whatever it is that he is listening to, and then I have to send back the art historical precedent, okay? So it's like a quiz. So, for example, he might send me Over the Rhine, Love and Revelation, and I'm like, oh, that's easy. It's Delacroix's Our Horses Fighting from 1860, and then I win, right? Sometimes it makes me say, oh, now I understand what she's doing. And I always win, even when he thinks that he has something that I'm like not gonna find a precedent for. Like, I always win. And sometimes I even surprise myself. This is Kamasi Washington's Heaven and Earth. And I was like, wait, that looks a lot like an Orthodox icon of the Transfiguration, you know, with this like figure that's standing with this on top of a triangular composition, and there's this gold and there's the blue. And I was like, but then that makes Kamasi Washington a Christ figure, and that makes me a little bit uncomfortable, but these themes are about heaven and earth meeting. Did he know? I'm not sure. I begin with these examples simply to demonstrate that my discipline, art history, which sometimes has a reputation for being about dry, old, musty things, is not merely the study of the things in Grandma's attic. Art history shows up everywhere, especially in our incredibly visual culture. Art historians understand that images are always in dialogue with each other, that new images reference old images to make meaning, even if we don't know that, even if we don't really understand how. And here's the thing, images are really, really powerful. They don't simply reflect cultural norms, they actually shape cultural expectations. So as Christians who are called to recognize the inherent dignity of all human beings, that we're supposed to see the very image of God, we have to be thoughtful and purposeful in how we engage with images, particularly images that represent people. In particular, we need to recognize how images, whether in high art or in visual popular culture, can open our eyes to injustice, or how they might blind us to the effects of the fall. Because if we are going to do justly, we have to be able to see justly. So tonight, I want to do three things. First, I want to give a very brief historical argument for why images matter and how we understand race in America. And then second, we'll look at a particular photograph and explore how it shapes our ideas of race and gender even today. And finally, I want to share a little bit of my own particular story of being humbled by images and called to look justly at my neighbor. This honestly might feel a little bit like a fire hose of information, but my goal here is to unsettle us a little bit, to have us slow down and think about something that we tend to think about very little. So first, how have images and the history of race in America been intertwined? Well, the very notion of race as a social category it has a long and very tangled history. When 19th century scientists wanted to prove racial inferiority, they turned to images to make their point. In 1839, for example, Samuel Morton published comparative charts that aligned the skulls of people of African descent with those of apes. In 1854, and again in 1857, Josiah Nott and George Glidden released these large, lavishly illustrated volumes that used images to prove the existence of a racial hierarchy. And I just want to point out on this slide in particular that the example of a white man is not actually a white man, but is in fact a sculpture of an ideal, right? But it was perhaps photography more than any other medium that has impacted the American notion of race. Anthropologists created a set of visual tropes that codified racial difference. So by emphasizing certain physical characteristics, by posing bodies in certain ways, and framing the image with text, photographs were supposed to offer proof of racial difference. And this example, a photograph that was commissioned by the Swiss anthropologist Louis Agassiz, supports this claim. He was working at Harvard University, and he wanted photographs that were going to prove that blacks and whites actually had different origins, had different creations. And so he commissioned photographs to be made of enslaved people at a South Carolina plantation. The slaves were stripped and forced to pose frontal, profile, and rear views for the camera. And the cool, seemingly objective nature of the photographs allowed for this sustained and detached scrutiny of the body. These are specimens that we get to look at. And crucially, Agassiz was not just looking to catalog differences, he wanted to put these differences into a hierarchy. So to say that whites were obviously better than blacks. So these photographs served as visual proof of black inferiority, and he expected anybody who looked at these photographs to see that as plainly legible. But racial hierarchies were also visually enforced in more subtle ways. In the early 19th century, the Long Island artist, this is a northern artist, William Sidney Mount, achieved great acclaim for his genre paintings, these scenes of everyday life. And free black figures appear regularly in his best-known paintings, and he's often been praised for the dignified portrayal of the black body. As some scholars have pointed out, however, Mount's paintings consistently depict black figures on the literal margins of the image. So if you look at this painting here, Rustic Dance After a Sleigh Ride, there are three black figures. There's one who's poking his head through the door. He's just served everyone by driving the sled. There's one standing sort of inside the fireplace, tending to the fire. And then there's one who's playing the fiddle, providing entertainment for everyone else who's dancing. Their cheerfulness at the edge of the scene, they're very happy. to be there, and by extension, society, suggests that a peaceful, racially integrated society is possible as long as Blacks accept the natural order of things and stay in their place. This doesn't strike us immediately as a racist image, and yet it suggests something about how things should be. But images could do much more vicious policing. In the late 19th and early 20th century, lynching became a powerful tool of racial control in the United States, particularly in the South. Racial lynchings were public spectacles. They were intended to be consumed visually, and photographs of lynchings crisscrossed the United States as photo postcards. Some of them, like this one, and I'm not going to show you the front, but the front depicts the dangling, burned body of Will Stanley, and a young man writes to his parents, "This is the barbecue we had last night. My picture's to the left with a cross over it. Your son, Joe." Photographs, like this is not unusual. The effect not only was one of emboldening white supremacists, but also a kind of visual script for Black Americans. The art historian Sean Smith observes that James Cameron, not the director, but James Cameron, a young Black man who miraculously survived a lynching in Marion, Indiana in 1930, he described his experience in photographic terms. So when he's interviewed later about his experience, he actually talks about his experience as if he is anticipating becoming like the images he has already seen, right? Images structure our embodied experience. Images do their work quietly and over time. Part of how images make meaning is by referencing, either positively or negatively, images that have come before them. So sometimes this is really purposeful. For example, the most famous artists in Western art history weren't coming up with new stuff. I hate to break it to you. This lets down my students all the time. When Michelangelo carves his David, for example, he is intentionally referencing Greek and Roman sculpture because he wants to attach his city, Florence, to a glorious classical past. And when Van Gogh paints Starry Night, he uses exactly the same composition as all the Dutch landscape painters that he had seen growing up. So sometimes the reference might be less intentional, but I like to think about it as an archive of visual imagery that we all carry around with us. Not all of us might be able to name all of the images that are in our archive. Some of them might only be in there as kind of half-remembered shadows, but we all have a kind of cataloging system, and new images that we see have to be filed somewhere. We can think about it like a filing cabinet, but I teach college students, and so usually I try to describe it to them more like a Google image search, right? So if I input something as innocuous as sunset into the Google image search bar, a host of highly saturated, glowing photographs and a few paintings appear, all of them vaguely familiar, and all of them reinforcing what a good sunset looks like. You know, the sunset that you see and you're like, oh, that looks like a painting. Well, where does that idea come from, right? And the Google search analogy extends to other examples that maybe have a little bit more culturally loaded implications. So a search for wedding brings up images of wedding bands and bouquets, but it's really dominated by photographs of thin, smiling, young, white, heterosexual couples, as if old fat people never get married, right? What does this tell us about our default expectations for what love and marriage should look like? And here's the thing, the gaps in our visual archive also matter. They matter a whole lot, the places that we don't have a file folder. So let me give you a quick personal example. I am half Japanese. I'm born and raised in Hawaii. And my great-grandmother, who was a first-generation immigrant, worked as a laundress for a sugarcane plantation, and then had her own sort of laundry side business. And in my first year of graduate school, I was flipping through a book looking for a topic to write a paper on, and I turned a page and I saw this. And I just froze. I had never seen this artwork before, but it seemed oddly familiar. It's an old-fashioned laundry crank attached to the wall, but instead of wet cotton pressed between those rollers, it's this long skein of black hair. Black, smooth, straight hair. It's my hair. It's my mom's hair. It's the hair of my friends that I braided at sleepovers growing up. It was pressed between a contraption that looked very much like my Obachang's crank that still lived in the crawl space of my grandfather's home back in Honolulu. And this sculpture, rung, was actually created by a Japanese-American artist, Lin Yamamoto, who was also born and raised in Hawaii, and who also had a grandmother who was a plantation laundress. This work was part of a loose series that she made where she tried to work through her immigrant grandmother's suicide, which followed Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. So by putting materials like hair, photographs, soap, and lard in compelling juxtaposition, she tried to reimagine the dark psychic space that maybe drove her grandmother to such a desperate act. I was so startled to see a reference to my body and my history in the pages of a book on art. I did not have a folder, if you will, in my visual archive for my own story. I had never seen my body in the pages of an art book. I had never seen my history, especially the achy parts, the complicated bits about the impact of colonialism, the exclusionary practices of immigration, hanging on the wall of a museum. And seeing myself, even in this abstracted way, in this context, meant that I had to create a whole new category in my visual archive. Click new folder, right? Maybe my body and my mother's body and my grandmother's body and my great-grandmother's body could actually go into the mental folder of American history alongside the paintings of George Washington and the photographs of Abraham Lincoln and the soldiers of D-Day. Here's the thing, our visual archives are particularly powerful when it comes to identifying and policing bodies. And this is especially true when we're thinking about photographs. In his important 1986 essay, Alan Sekula argues that photographs teach us what heroism, morality, and fame should look like, and they do so largely through contrast. So photographs of heroes and celebrities teach us what is respectable, and photographs of the criminal, the insane, and the poor teach us what is not. Given photography's role in molding and sustaining white supremacy and racial ideology, it should come as no surprise that photography was also seen as a potential tool for dismantling racial inequality by abolitionists and by civil rights activists. So Frederick Douglass remains the most photographed person of the 19th century, of the entire 19th century. He's urgently crafting a public vision of what Black dignity looks like. And as many scholars have noted, photography is also closely tied to the civil rights movement. Mamie Till chose to photograph and publish images of her son's brutally disfigured body as visual proof of racism in the South. She said, "They had to see what I had seen. The whole nation had to bear witness to this." Now, ultimately, it was only Black periodicals that published the gut-wrenching photographs of Emmett Till, but they inspired a new swell of activism by young men and women. And later, images of protesters being attacked by police dogs or sprayed by firefighter hoses or beaten by state troopers shocked the white readers of Life magazine and national newspapers. One such image was this one. Elizabeth Eckford walking towards Little Rock High School in 1957 while a livid Hazel Bryan screams over her shoulder. Who's seen this photograph before? Okay, great, just about everyone. I'm guessing that it was probably in a history textbook, maybe a PBS special on civil rights or something like that, right? It's an educational image. It primarily serves as proof that something has happened. But have you ever looked at it closely? What do we see here? Okay. I see bodies pressed together tightly in a cropped, square, black and white image. 2 rows of figures stretched across the photograph's middle ground, striding towards the viewer. In the back row, you can catch a glimpse of 2 helmeted soldiers and a few men in light straw hats. But most of the figures we see here are young women. Women with neat hair, crisp dresses, and narrowed eyes. But the focus of the image is in the foreground. Another young woman walking alone, also in an immaculate white shirt dress, big sunglasses kind of concealing her face. But the clear separation from the rest of the people in the photograph encourages us to recognize her visible difference. She is the only black figure, surrounded by a seemingly hostile, screaming crowd. Just behind her left shoulder, a white girl squints her eyes and opens her mouth in a snarling, ferocious yell. Now, this image, as you may know, does have a kind of feel-good story. Eckford was one of the Little Rock Nine, a group of young, high-performing students chosen by the NAACP to integrate the previous all-white high school. On September 4th, 1957, the governor of Arkansas deployed National Guard troops to keep black students out of the school. So Eckford doesn't actually make it into the building on the day that this photograph is made. But this image was published the following morning in the Arkansas Gazette, and then was quickly picked up by other national newspapers. And it stoked an outcry over how Eckford and the other black students had been treated. The photographs, in part, forced President Eisenhower to intervene. And just a few years later, they functioned as a kind of shorthand for a fight well fought over school integration. So the story goes, when faced with photographic evidence of racism, kind-hearted white viewers rallied to support the cause of desegregation. That's the story we like to tell about this image. And it seems so simple, right? Like, it's a straightforward image. It doesn't need complicated interpretation. There's no symbolism. There's no artist signature to decode, anything like that. And we might really be happy to see the photograph as a kind of trophy. Something bad happened in the past, we fixed it, and now it can go into our history textbooks. We are particularly apt to believe that this is true because it is a photograph. Photography, especially black and white news photography, has a certain kind of authority. It asserts its objectivity and its truthfulness. Since the mid-19th century, photographic images have been easily and cheaply copied and disseminated, and this has aligned it more with mass culture or machine culture. When you look at an oil painting or a marble sculpture, you know that it was made, right? It's a little bit harder to remember that a photograph is also a made thing. And that's also what the cultural critic Pierre Bourdieu, describes the reality effect. So by their nature, photographs are an index or an imprint. So because analog photography is literally light writing, there's a physical relationship between what's in front of the lens and then what actually shows up on the negative. We have great faith in photography's truthfulness. We claim that a photograph is worth 1,000 words. But here's the thing. Remember what we said earlier about how photographs helped create the very idea of race? Images don't just live in the past. Instead, they play an active role today. And this one, in particular, continues to impact us by setting up categories like the good girl and the bad girl, the good black and the bad white. The image continues to do its work today every time we see it, asking us to naturalize, to take for granted certain expectations of race, gender, and even class. In effect, this and countless other images try to teach us how things ought to be. It's the archive that teaches us what is normal, acceptable, honorable, and so on. So we might be able to recognize pretty easily that a Crest teeth whitening ad is selling us a bogus notion of how the world ought to be, right? Nobody's teeth should or can actually be that white all the time. But when it comes to a historical photograph like this one, and to really important categories like race and gender, we are very often swayed by the implicit ought. So I want to do a quick theological parenthetical here and ask, what does the Bible teach us about the ought, about the created, God-ordained order of race and gender? Well, the Bible clearly states in Genesis 1:27 that God created both man and woman in his own image. He creates male and female, instituting an order that, for whatever mysterious reason, best reflects the fullness of his nature. What does the Bible not do? It does not go on to describe the first woman, Eve, as a demure, tender, emotional nurturer who likes flower decorating. And it does not go on to describe Adam as a bold, strong, and certain leader who only eats bacon, right? But too often throughout history, we have treated cultural notions of femininity and masculinity as if they are how the world ought to be. And we've turned a blind eye to how these social structures have oftentimes relegated women to the margins, denying their inherent and equal value with men. Okay, so that was easy, that's gender. How about race? When the Bible talks about race, it really only speaks of one race, the human race. Everyone in the human race is an image bearer, and everyone is fallen. But at the same time, the Bible does not set forward a monoculture as an ideal. It has a lot to say about what we call ethnicity. Ethnicity describes a population group whose members identify with each other on the basis of shared cultural traditions. And so in this beautiful description of heaven in Revelation 7, John sees every nation, tribe, people, and language bowing down before the Lamb. There is a diversity of people groups who have maintained their distinctiveness even as they unify together to worship the one true God. God's created order endows men and women of all people groups with equal dignity as image bearers, and he delights in the praise of a multi-ethnic people in the world to come. So this is our ought. Back to this photograph. What are we being told the ought is here? Well, remember, images make meaning through the archive. So what comparisons are being made and what contrasts? Well, Eckford's attire, posture, and demeanor present her as a young American girl. She looks like what a deserving or respectable young woman should look like. And there are journalists that day who describe her as being aristocratic. Wearing a crisp, neatly ironed dress and pressed hair, Eckford mirrors the poised, fresh-faced models in a Sears catalog. But since the archive also works through contrast, we also have to think about what categories Eckford resists. So she is neither the hypersexualized, exotic object of desire, nor is she the desexualized, unattractive mammy. And these are the two stereotypes most often granted to Black women. So she's safe, she's non-threatening. The photograph's more subtle argument, constructed through the archive, is that Elizabeth Eckford could be assimilated into good white society without too much fuss or discomfort. Okay? But Eckford's body also falls into another archival category of Blackness, that of the noble Black body in pain. And this subject has a long history in photography, embodied clearly in this 1863 photograph of a freedman now known only as Gordon. Here we see a Black body damaged by brutal Southern whites, put on display to galvanize the support of Northern liberals. Art historian Martin Berger argues that this same visual formula of inactive Blacks and active whites dominates the most well-known and frequently reproduced images of the civil rights movement. It's this body, the body that doesn't fight back, but that bears pain and disgrace quietly, that Martin Luther King Jr. and others in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference would find to be particularly effective in their nonviolent direct actions against segregation. And I want to be clear here that I am not criticizing this kind of nonviolent resistance. I just want us to think about what happens when those are the bodies that are repeated and sort of heroized. And then on the other hand, it's that seemingly stoic, passive body that the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and later the Black Panthers rejected because they wanted to represent potent, self-fashioned agency. And that made many people in dominant white culture very uncomfortable. Now, meanwhile, our tendency is probably to disassociate from the screaming young woman in the background. Regardless of your ethnicity or your gender, I bet none of you want to be associated with Hazel Bryan, right? The sun illuminates her face from the side, outlining her ferociously gaping mouth. Her eyes pinched together, she is glaring at Elizabeth Eckford's back. Unlike Eckford, Bryan does not seem to be upholding notions of middle-class respectability. Instead of smiling primly like a Sears catalog model, Bryan is releasing this torrent of emotion in a very public space. And in doing so, she aligns herself with photographs like these, commissioned by the French neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot in the late 19th century. Charcot's photographs of women under his care at a psychiatric hospital constructed a visual language of insanity manifested through hyper-emotionalism. There's all kinds of other things we could get into there. Now, nobody is going to look at this photograph from Little Rock and try to diagnose Hazel Bryan with a psychiatric disorder. But the fact remains that our photographic archive, the folder that we have in our brain, right, categorizes her as someone who is outside of polite society. Her public expression functionally denies her social class and her gender. She is not acting as a good white lady ought. And in fact, she's kind of acting like a villain should, right? Now, here's the thing. In 1957, white viewers of this photograph were very quick to disavow Hazel Bryan. An article in the newspaper described her as having her mouth open in hate like a dog's, so they aligned her with an animal. A letter to the Milwaukee Journal calls her a disgrace to the female sex. She doesn't get to be a woman anymore. Even segregationists distanced themselves from Bryan, and she was soon forced to transfer to another high school. She had disregarded the unspoken conventions of middle-class whiteness, and in doing so, her race was called into question. She was publicly classified as white trash, a label that signified not only a low economic status, but a low moral status as well. Journalists covering the story called her and others agitating against desegregation scrawny rednecked men, slattern housewives, and harpies. And these descriptions echoed the unflattering depictions of poor white sharecroppers taken 2 decades earlier by Margaret Burke White and included in her book, You Have Seen Their Faces. These images were captioned with first-person sentiments that were actually written by Burke White and her collaborator, Erskine Caldwell. So in this one, a woman with chapped, cracked lips and uneven teeth and wrinkled, dried skin squints and grimaces at the sun. And the quote that's next to her that she didn't actually say is, "Snuff is an almighty help when your teeth ache." So her moral bankruptcy is equated with her physical deterioration and her poverty. Do you see that equation? So by 1959, Hazel Bryan's reputation was cemented by national news coverage that asserted that the ugly faces of rednecks, crackers, Tar Heels, and other poor white trash would be those remembered from Little Rock. That's not honoring the image of God either. Declaring Hazel Bryan and other white protesters at Little Rock Central High School to be white trash allowed the majority of white American public to remove themselves from any real responsibility in the increasingly violent struggle for Black civil rights. Racism could be explained as a personal problem perpetuated by morally flawed individuals, like by schoolgirls. You can always retrain a schoolgirl, is the idea, right? The more uncomfortable work of examining the racial biases of social structures could just be ignored, or at the very least, downplayed. So this one photograph, by referencing the archive, proposed several things. It told us what a good girl looks like, Elizabeth Eckford, or a good Black girl would look like. Elizabeth Eckford looking like a poised Sears catalog model, just with darker skin, and she needs your help. It told us what a bad white trash girl would look like, Hazel Bryan looking like an out-of-control animal in her rage. And it told us, through contrast, what a good white person would look like, not Hazel Bryan. The photograph reinforced very narrow categories of how one should or should not act in order to be accorded dignity. And it actually impacted the lives, not just of these two young women, but hundreds of other Black school children who are integrating public schools in the South. Now, with historical distance, some of you might be able to recognize the shortcomings of such an attitude. But Johnny Jenkins' photograph of a noble, stoic Elizabeth Eckford and a screaming, animalistic Hazel Bryan continues to affect us. An apparently simple documentary photograph can establish certain ideas about race and gender as natural. It declares itself to be a direct imprint of the created order, when in fact the fall is twisting our ability to see. This teaches us that certain Black bodies deserve our concern, and certain white bodies deserve our derision. It teaches us that there is a certain way to be a woman in public, and if you break those rules, you will be punished. And it does all of this quietly and so powerfully. As Christians who are called to recognize and dignify God's image in all people, we must work to acknowledge how our own archives may have hampered or distorted our love for our neighbors. So I've argued that images, even images from popular culture, are part of an archive, that this archive helps us categorize people and experiences. And sometimes this is seemingly innocuous, but images can also shape our expectations about really important things like race and gender. Now, since you're here tonight, I probably don't need to convince you that this is a big deal. We should still be talking about this. But some people might wonder, in an America that elected a Black president and where Black Panther broke box office records and a Black recording artist like Beyonce can make millions of dollars for a single show, it might be tempting to think that racism and sexism are a thing of the past. But I and millions of my other brothers and sisters of color can tell you that this is not the case. You can obviously just look at the news from the past month or two and see clearly that racism and misogyny are still very powerful forces in the world. So let me try instead to explain how this historical photograph matters, because it continues to shape how we interpret contemporary images and, by extension, actual people. So take, for example, two fairly recent photographs of Black women in the news. First, we have this one of Aisha Evans, taken in the summer of 2016 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. This is during a protest that followed the fatal police shooting of Alton Sterling. The view of the protest is eerily empty. Evans stands in profile, just center right of the image, alone in the middle of the road. Her arms are pulled back close to her body. Her hands are up and open, cradling her keys and her phone. She is standing still, but this patterned summer dress is just barely fluttering around her body. And then you have these two bulky figures clad in black helmets and armor with these big, large visors rushing towards Evan from the left of the composition. Contrasting with Evan's poise, these figures are caught mid-movement, scrambling to a halt. And again, this image raises a host of references. One commentator, and I agree with him, even observed that the image reminded him of a scene from Star Wars, a kind of standoff between a Jedi warrior and faceless stormtroopers. There is nothing here that makes you want to empathize with the officers, right? They are faceless and nameless and like almost disembodied. But Evans is also the stoic, patient body, so familiar from the civil rights photography, the passive figure in need of our help. She is, in many ways, another Elizabeth Eckford, a particular notion of what acceptable femininity and blackness might look like in opposition to an anonymous and thus easily vilified show of force. But what about this image? Here we see a woman with muscular arms and a clenched hand yelling into a megaphone. Her mouth is open, the tendons on her neck and in her arms are popping into definition from the force of her yell. Her hair is shaved on the sides, the middle springs up in this tightly curled mohawk. Several white figures stand behind her, a few watching while others are seemingly involved in conversation. She is taking up space, right, with her body and with her voice. She is not Elizabeth Eckford. She does not align with acceptable standards of femininity or decorum. She instead might be seen as the angry black woman or the sapphire stereotype, the black woman who's masculine, aggressive, and talks back. And the image might make us uncomfortable. We might think that she should be more peaceful or more persuasive. She should think about her audience more. But I want us to consider that perhaps part of our discomfort with this image might be bound up in very complicated ways with the fact that she is disregarding the visual categories of appropriate blackness and womanhood that we have assumed to be natural, that we have assumed to be part of the created order. Have we declared something to be an ought, to be the created order, when in fact we are grappling with the results of the fall in us? And let's also push from this into the realm of images to our own embodied experiences. If past images play such a powerful role in how we interpret new images, then consider too how they might impact the ways we respond to actual human beings in our lives. Do you see how much is at stake here? How the images in our archive teach us quietly and slowly who we should honor, who we should believe, who we should listen to. If we're not careful and thoughtful with them, images can mislead us to believe a bent view of gender and race. And I want to share an extended personal example here. When I moved to St. Louis for graduate school, I had a pretty firm belief in meritocracy. My husband and I were responsible with our budget, so we had money to buy a house. This is my narrative. The lower-income neighborhood we had moved into was surely on the cusp of turning around and improving if only other responsible folks would move in. I had worked hard to get into graduate school, and I expected that if I worked hard in graduate school, I would, of course, get a job. But these beliefs didn't help me love my neighbor better, or at all. They did not encourage me to look with love at the black mom at the grocery store with her cart full of inexpensive carbs. They did not call me to see the dignity of the young black men in baggy pants waiting at the metro stop in the middle of the day. And then I saw a painting by Kehinde Wiley. A young black man in baggy pants and a hoodie perches on a rearing horse, and this sumptuous network of golden curls swirl behind and around him. He looks regal and powerful and familiar, but not. Wiley invited young black men from his Harlem neighborhood to choose poses from an art history book, books primarily populated with one kind of body. The painting is familiar because it's based on the image on the right, an equestrian portrait by Diego Velázquez of the Count Duke Olivares. And if you haven't seen this painting before, you've certainly seen one of the dozens of other images that look like it. Side note, Old Town Road, when he's rearing up on the horse, the whole reason that that video makes sense is because of paintings like this one. I can talk to you more about that later. Ask me. But I realized that what was so disruptive to me was that I didn't expect to see a young Black man in a position of power in a giant painting in an art gallery. I didn't have a folder in my visual archive for a dignified young Black man in street clothes. I just didn't. The painting challenged me to look again at my neighbor, to see my literal neighbors as people who should be accorded just as much dignity and respect as the Count Duke, not because of their merit, but because of their image bearing. The painting disrupted my ideas about who deserves honor, and it also forced me to ask really hard questions about why that gap existed in my archive and in the art history books to begin with. Expanding my archive meant doing some work, asking questions, listening humbly, seeking out histories that were not my own, of my new city in particular, and then my nation as a whole. But it was work that needed to be done because I needed to be able to see people as God sees. One way that we can do this is to look more, not less. We should work to seek out images, photographs in particular, that might complicate or disrupt our understanding of race as a historical construct. One of my favorite examples is this one by the African-American photographer Gordon Parks from 1956. This is taken 1 year before desegregation in Little Rock, and Gordon Parks, who's the first Black photographer for Life magazine, goes on assignment to Mobile, Alabama. On this assignment, though, Parks uses color film rather than the usual black and white. And in one image published in the photo essay, Restraints Open and Hidden, we face this glass storefront window plastered with advertisements for banana splits, ice cream sandwiches, and butter pecan ice cream. There are 7 figures and 2 water fountains, but only one fountain is being used. The second fountain, emblazoned with the words white only, creates this column, right, of negative space, almost like there's a force field around it. We might find this image to be unexpected and upsetting. Color images like this tend to create a greater sense of immediacy than black and white photographs. It's harder to put this in the past. And this image, like the rest that Parks took while on that assignment, focuses on the everyday, on the mundane experiences of a family in Mobile. They sit on a porch, they go to theater, they go to church, they chop wood, they play outside. The boycotts, the protests, the brutal acts of retaliation that are occurring at the same time in Alabama don't show up in this photo essay. But it is this really ordinary moment at the water fountain that speaks so powerfully of the consistent, insistent ordering of life along racial lines. Parks presents the family not as victims of white violence, but as active agents who are making everyday choices about how they are going to negotiate a Jim Crow world. Are they going to drink at that water fountain or not? Parks' photographs offer what might be new material for our visual archive, and they encourage a more robust imagination of lives lived outside of the iconic image, the famous image. So how can you expand your archive? Will you take the time to seek out more textured, more complicated ways of imaging our world? It doesn't necessarily take a vast knowledge of art history and visual culture to begin to look more faithfully. When looking at historical or contemporary news photographs, we can simply but self-consciously ask ourselves, what's my initial response to the people in the image? With whom do we choose to align ourselves? Who are we critical of? And then, rather than just accepting those responses as natural or normal, we can question why we feel that way. Perhaps we can answer the question with a specific set of images from history. Perhaps we can't. But the act of acknowledging that a single photograph is part of a larger, complex web of meaning can stymie, can stop that seductive notion that the photograph tells us everything that we need to know. Bringing others into conversation about such images can also help us, can help broaden our archive, encourages us to look carefully at images that we might otherwise be prone to ignore. Such conversations also offer a more concrete way of tackling issues that can feel elusive, that can feel abstract. Oftentimes, it's a lot easier to talk about a difficult social issue when you are grounding it in an image rather than talking about just sort of like generalities or things that you've heard in the news. And I really want you all to hear this. Christ, who is indeed Lord over all, has used my discipline of art history to affect my sanctification. Art history has taught me and continues to teach me to recognize that the images I see are not simply reflections of how things are. They actively shape how I think things should be. Art history has humbled me. It has driven me back to Scripture and to my knees, where I need to beg God for grace to acknowledge my limitations. I still do this all the time. Part of pursuing faithfulness is daily asking for the capacity to see the imago Dei in people and the images of people that I encounter. Because in order to do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly, we must be able to see clearly, and we must be able to look with eyes of love. Thank you.
Can you move the table? Thank you so much. That was beautiful. So, in the time that remains, we're going to give you an opportunity to text some questions. I wish I had thought to tell you that sooner, but that's what that phone number is. So, if you want to take a moment, think about a question that you may have, and we're going to get some help from Ken and Tyler. They're going to process those, and Carl and I are going to field those questions. So I actually have one for you to begin with. So the first question is, how do you think the selfie culture intersects with the image file gap that you mentioned?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think for, as acceptable as it is culturally to kind of selfie shame and to say, oh, kids these days always taking pictures of themselves, there is a sense where selfie culture has broadened the archive in really radical ways, where people who don't see themselves represented in dominant media are able to make and to disseminate images of themselves and to share it through hashtags, like with other people who might be interested. The term in Hawaii for people who are part Asian is hapa, and so there's a hashtag on Twitter and Instagram, hashtag hapa, where I can see thousands of other people who look a little bit like me when I feel kind of out of place. So I think there's something to that. My grandfather, my late grandfather, second generation Japanese immigrant, he loved a selfie. He would take selfies of himself all the time, post them to Facebook, and I loved it because there's not like a lot of photographs of old Japanese men just hanging out in their bedroom, but there he was, So I try to think about how selfie culture, can have this impact of like really broadening and adding texture to the visual archive. I think the flip side of that, for those of us who are maybe making selfies and disseminating them, is why are we doing that, and how might we be pinning our sense of dignity and self-worth on the likes that we get, on the views that we receive, rather than finding our sense of worth and dignity in our identity in Christ and as image bearers.
And along with that, I read an article that talked about how selfies are a way of embalming ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
That's powerful, because think about how many, I need 15 selfies before I have one that I want to post. I don't know about you. It usually takes about 15. And I have someone who I know very well who says, do not shoot from underneath because that's double chin zone. It needs to be eye level or above. But I will not look at your table right now because you're here right now. But you know who
but
you
you
are.
know, then also think about, well, what's wrong with the double chin?
Well, we
You
can
know,
talk.
where did we get that idea?
Right.
That
That's right.
is not how we should want to see ourselves represented.
That's right. And like you, I remember, and this only happened recently, and I think it is because of social media, that I found a particular designer who looks like me. She is biracial. I'm Hispanic, 100% Hispanic, but she's under height for her weight. Think about that. She's under height for her weight. I love that. And she has big hair, and she loves style and clothes, and I was frozen. It was really something. So, anyway, it was a great feeling.
Yeah.
Let's see. Do you have a question?
I
Carl?
do,
All right,
yes.
awesome.
Okay.
Okay.
So
I feel like we're back in the classroom.
Yeah, we
Carl.
are back in the classroom. This is great. I really missed this. But as a college student coming into Covenant, I had no idea like where I was going to go, what I was going to do, and I wandered into one of your classes. How do you go about starting this conversation with students or the next generation, or how do you begin that with people that wander in?
Yeah. I always try to, so when I teach, particularly when I'm teaching intro to art history, which I think is where we started. Yeah. I always try to, like on the very first day, to make a pitch for how art history matters today. So kind of like how I started with you guys with these album cover comparisons. I've started Intro to Art History by talking about Beyonce's Vogue cover. And so like, how did that happen? How does that have art historical significance? This year I really did talk about Old Town Road for my first lecture. And I said, here's the history of horses in visual imagery. And then we ended with Lil Nas X on a horse rearing up. And I was like, this is where it comes from. It comes from somewhere. So part of it is, I think, just showing folks that we live in this incredibly visual culture, and that it might feel intuitive. It might feel like, oh, I know how to look at that, or I know what it's trying to say. But they all have histories. They all have stories and layers behind them. And so that's where I like to kind of start the conversation. Ask the question, why? Why do you think that about the image?
That's awesome.
Yeah, and where do you go? You have 2 young boys that I've got to babysit and love on. But where do you begin as they're growing up, even entering into these discussions or entering into these conversations?
We talk a lot. I mean, unsurprisingly, I am not a fun mom. When we go on vacation, I'm like, let's go to the art museum, And we have a lot of conversations about photographs in the news or images in like books that they bring home from the library of, oh, how do you know? And they're not all like these big serious conversations about race and gender. It might just be a conversation about like, how do you know that that's the good guy in this picture? How do you know who's the most important person in the picture? And then we'll start to talk about composition. Well, the most important person is usually in the middle. We might talk about size. The most important person is often larger, or they have a different kind of color, or something like that. So just teaching them, visual literacy by asking questions about everything that they see. And then sometimes it does kind of get more into, there have been moments when Zeke, my oldest, who probably thinks a little bit too hard for his own good, will see a commercial or something like that, and he'll be like, Mom, was that racist? And then we'll have a conversation about it, and talk about how actually that question, is it racist, is the least interesting question we could ask about the image, and the much more interesting question is, how did we get there in the first place? Like, what is the trail of images that led us there?
That's awesome.
Yeah, and the best thing was watching Miles enter into the art museum with this intro to art history class and begin to break down these complex images that college kids were baffled over and couldn't understand.
Yeah.
How old is Miles at that point?
He was 7.
He was 7 or 8.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. All right, I've got another one here. in today's digital age, how can we trust that what we see is real? How is Photoshop distorting our archives?
That's a great question. You can't trust what you see is real, sorry. But you couldn't trust for a long time that what you see is real. Before Photoshop, there were all kinds of other ways of manipulating images, either in the darkroom or simply by the photographer's choice. You know, there are other images from this same day that don't have the same sense of like direct confrontation and danger. If you pull out from this scene a little bit, and you see it more from the side, the bodies don't seem as closely packed. It doesn't seem as much as a confrontation between Hazel Bryan and Elizabeth Exford. So the point of view of the photographer, the visual choices that Johnny Jenkins made when he takes this photograph, that actually has already done a lot of manipulation for us. It has set us up to understand things in a certain way. And so I tell my students, you know, again, the answer is not to look less, but to look more, so that you have more images of a historical moment, so that you have more images of a time period or of a people group, so you're not hinging all of your expectations just on a single iconic image. And that allows you to imagine these people as having lives outside of the frame, right? So rather than Elizabeth Eckford being perpetually locked as the victim here, can we imagine her laughing? Can we imagine her dancing and going to prom or something like that? Can we imagine Hazel Bryan having a sweet conversation with her mother? Like, can we look back into this photograph and see the dignity of the Imago Dei here? Now, that doesn't really cover things like the photoshopped image of the shark leaping up out of the ocean, grabbing the helicopter or stuff like that. Those you're gonna have to use like, I don't know, Snopes.com or something to like help you. But again, if you keep looking at images, I think it also teaches you to say, oh yeah, I guess I understand why they took it from that point of view, or I wonder what it would have looked like if they did this other thing, you know.
Do you have a few more? I've
Yeah.
got 2 more. How about you?
Okay.
Let's each take one question.
Okay,
each.
that's perfect.
Okay, great.
Okay, so the image right here with the angry white woman in the background, you know, you talked about us saying, well, I'm not her, I don't want to be her.
Mm-hmm.
You know, can we talk a little bit more about how that image constructs our, you know, our view of saying, I don't want to be her?
Yeah. I mean, part of the reason this image is so successful is because it gives the viewer the implicit position of savior. Like that Elizabeth Eckford is walking towards us as the viewer. And we want to believe that we will be the person who will say, come here, like I will help you. I will not be like those bad people in the background, right? And if you think about a lot of aid photography, if you think about images of refugee mothers in Sudan with their children, there's that similar kind of expectation that you as the viewer are the one who is going to step in and be the savior and be the helper. And so probably when we're looking at a photograph like this, the person that we least want to be in the image is probably the person we should ask ourselves, how are we like them, right? If we really believe in a doctrine of total depravity, if we really believe that we are all capable of the worst sins imaginable, if we are honest with ourselves, we probably would never be the people who would have said, I'm going to take a stand against slavery, or I'm going to take a stand against this social evil. We need to really look at a photograph like this and say, I might be Hazel Bryan. I don't want to be Hazel Bryan, but I might be Hazel Bryan. Like, how does a photograph like this drive me to confession, right? How does a photograph like this make me think about my own sin? And that's uncomfortable and takes a lot more work than just saying like, whew, glad that's over.
That's powerful. So do you happen to know if Elizabeth ever commented on this photo?
There's actually a great book called Elizabeth and Hazel that just looks at this photograph and the relationship of these two women. Many years after the photograph, they actually meet. Hazel Bryan starts writing to Elizabeth Eckford, and they meet, and they have a kind of tentative friendship for a number of years that's later fractured for some complicated reasons. And it's a great book because, again, it helps you think about these women as having to live with this photograph for a long time. And Elizabeth Eckford in particular, I mean, both of them were quite traumatized by the aftermath of the photograph, right? Elizabeth Eckford is sort of pushed into center stage. She was not supposed to be alone. She had somehow gotten separated from the other 8 students of the Little Rock Nine. So she's being confronted by the National Guard all by herself, and that's not how it's supposed to be. Her parents were livid when they found out that that's what had happened to their little girl. Hazel Bryan wasn't even supposed to be there that day. She didn't have strong segregationist feelings. She just she was a 15-year-old with a difficult home life who wanted attention. And so she joins this protest and kind of gets herself put into that. There's so much that we don't know about this photograph, but it announces itself to be so clear, so easy to understand, that we are often lazy about asking those kinds of questions, right? Of being able to see everybody in here as an image bearer who has a story.
Excellent. Well, in interest of time, I think we need to conclude, but I do want to give you an opportunity to tell us about the table that you have set up over here.
Yeah, so I teach at Covenant College. We have some T-shirts, we have some brochures and other information about the college there if you're interested. Note cards if any of you are high schoolers and would like to be contacted in the future. But I also have, I'm a recent contributor to a book, His Testimonies, My Heritage, Women of Color on the Word of God. And it's a book of devotionals on Psalm 119, written entirely by women of color, edited by Christy Anyabwile. She's a Bible teacher. Her husband, Tabidi Anyabwile, writes for the Gospel Coalition. So you can buy them on Amazon for $15, but they're $10 here tonight if you would like to buy a copy. And reading, honestly, is another way that you can have your archive of voices expanded, right? Where you can have other kinds of voices in your life. So, thank you.
That's awesome.
Thank
Can
you,
we please
Doctor.
give her a warm thank you?
Thank you. I'm Ken Leggett, and just one closing thought as I get to sit out here with you. I hope you saw yourself in some of those images tonight. And I hope you actually didn't agree with everything you heard, for that makes for much better conversation and dialogue, although I pretty much agreed with everything. So that would be boring conversation. If you're an artist, or if you're a photographer, thank you for doing what you do. Tonight, you got to see how powerful and what an impact your gift to the world can bring. A closing thought is this. We are going to continue this conversation. We want to invite you back January 29th, where we will have 28th. January
29th.
Oh.
Is it the 28th?
Wednesday the 29th.
Okay, it's Wednesday the 28th, same time, same place.
Oh.
And we're going to continue this stream of thinking about God's diverse kingdom, race, gender, and the image of God. And we're going to have Dr. Mono Soto Ivy, who, why is that so? 29th? Did I say 28 4 times?
Yes.
Okay, so hey, let's all say it together. What date is it?
The 29th.
Thank you. I'll see you on the 28th. All right, so a professor from Belmont is going to be our guest speaker again, and we would love to have you here on the 29th. All right, with that said, enjoy your evening.
Thank you so much.